Sandy Pitcher is the Chief Executive of the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources and commenced in that role in January 2015. Sandy is focusing on developing a vibrant nature-based tourism strategy for South Australia, connecting people to parks and delivering on the state's ambitious climate change agenda. Prior to this, Sandy was the Deputy Chief Executive of the Department of Premier and Cabinet for 5 years, and prior to that was the Director of the Office for Women. In this role, Sandy led the implementation of the state government's plan for South Australia to become a national leader in gender equity, and she was a delegate to the social inclusion stream of the Australia 2020 Summit in Canberra. Sandy was awarded the South Australian Telstra Businesswoman of the Year Award in 2012 and went on to win the national title later that year. Sandy was raised in Manor and has 2 young daughters, Tilly and Tess. And welcome, Sandy. We look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and for having me here today. And I just want to acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land as well as on this beautiful oval, so it's an honour on both of those counts. So as was said, I'm going to talk a little bit about International Women's Day, but I'm also going to talk about leading the Department for Environment, Water and Natural Resources. And part of the reason I want to do that is that I'm just so proud to lead such a great part of our state. And I feel that as South Australians and one Northern Territorian, I hear, I'd like to share some of the way that I feel really proud in the job that I get to do, and I'll weave that story in for you. So, International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day first to all of you. And what I want to say firstly is that I was reflecting about this, and as was mentioned, I've been Chief Executive for 2 years. Now, for most of that time, I have been one of only 1 or 2 Chief Executives who are women in the state government, which I think we can all agree is a number less than we are striving to have. And so often I'm called upon to speak on International Women's Day and other things. And last year, I did a particular thing that I want to confess to all of you. I spoke to a group of young women, and there was a real push. They were a bit, surely gender equality's here, and what are we worrying about? So I actually gave them, I suppose, what I'd almost reflect on as quite a pessimistic talk of, this isn't done yet, that isn't done yet, there are still so many things. But later that afternoon, I was asked to speak to a group of almost, I have to call them the true believing feminists, older than me, and I don't want to give my age away, but International Women's Day started being celebrated in 1975, and that may or may not coincide with my year of birth. So I'm about as old as the days are young, and this group of women had been fighting the fight for much longer than I'd been born. They had been there when women weren't able to work in the public sector when they married. They'd been there when women weren't allowed in front bars. They'd been there fighting equal pay. And they, I think, were sort of at the other end where they're just thinking, well, really, has all of our fighting been for nothing? And I actually gave probably what I would call a really rousing and enthusiastic speech about how much we've achieved and how proud we should be and all of these things that have changed that we would never have expected. I got home that night and I thought, how strange, how almost duplicitous, I thought. I've given 2 completely contrasting stories about International Women's Day, but actually both of them are true. They really do coexist. We have achieved so much. There is so much to celebrate in terms of gender equality. The fact that I'm speaking here to you today as a Chief Executive of a government department is one small example. But there is still a lot that is wrong too. And I think that this is best captured in the fact that we are measuring how far we are from equality, because what measure matters. But when Ernst & Young did the question about how long on current predictions would it take for us to achieve gender equality on a whole lot of measures, they hit 170 years, 10 months and 4 weeks. I think we can all agree we want it to speed up a bit more than that. So today, what I'm going to do is whiz past both sides of the duality, the parallel of why we still need to think about International Women's Day and why the job is not done, but also really reflect on some of the positive things and what all of us can do about that journey. So 7 reasons why International Women's Day is more important than ever. This could be 107 reasons if you really pushed it, and there are so many parts of the story. But the one that I really do focus on, and the one that really works for me, is talking about education. We actually know that if we could change the number of women and girls who access education around the world, we would actually achieve poverty reduction, we'd achieve health outcomes, we'd achieve life expectancy change. We already know this information, so why is it that we haven't been able to turn that around? And I think the international story is very checkered here. We're achieving bounds in some countries and we really are slipping backwards in others. And International Women's Day, the I in International Women's Day is very important, because I'm always really concerned that we don't just focus down on Australia, but we think about our place in the global world. And I know that Rotary in all of its days, the international focus is very important to you and your organisation too. So that's a little bit of the doom and gloom list, I have to confess. And the case for International Women's Day probably reaches its greatest doom and gloom when you actually look at some of our neighbours, and some of the challenges that they're facing are really life and death ones. And I always think that the work that UN Women and other groups are doing on this day does give us that sense of reminding us what we should do as global citizens in terms of failing our poorest girls. But in Australia, so bringing us back home a little bit, we know, and it's the duality point again, we know that South Australia has such a proud history of gender equality. We were the first place in the world to grant women the vote in 1894. That has been something that I've grown up with as an intrinsic set of pride. And yet we still have the sense that we're taking one step forward, but there are still so many things that are being left behind. And I think that it's about celebrating our successes, but remembering there is still a need to do better. So this brings me to one of the points that I want to make. And this is something that is the takeaway for all of us. It's what I hope that you think about when you leave the room today and enjoy the rest of the glorious festival fringe in Adelaide and International Women's Day. And that is unconscious bias. And I don't know if you've heard this phrase before, but it's about making us recognise that there are things that we do in our lives that are a form of bias that we are unaware of. So as people, we do things that are automatic and out of our control. It's that thinking that you do before you consciously think. And it can happen around race, sex, gender, expectations of your family. There's all the different ways that unconscious bias operates. And I think it's really important to name it and talk about it. I do have a friend who we had a big debate last week about this. She said unconscious bias, insert her swear word. It's just bias and sexism. Don't call it unconscious bias. Don't apologise for it. But I do apologise for it. I do think that it's worth recognising that all of us, even those of us who have been committed to working for gender equality and against sexism, actually will have our biases too, because we're all humans. We have this innate way that our brains are wired to have bias. It's the way our survival instinct operates. And we make fast judgments. It's how we live our lives. So I don't think that excusing sexism is what unconscious bias does, but I think it's recognising that it's not about blaming people, but it's about giving us a tool ourselves to be better. And I think if we can all recognise our own biases and change the way that we operate, we are taking huge steps, not only for gender equality and creating a better society in our lives, but actually the way we act differently to our children and the social constructs that happen around our boys and our girls. So I'm going to just dwell only slightly on some university studies, because I just think some of the things that they're finding is fascinating. So Cornell University, they asked the question, I wonder if there's a motherhood bias. I wonder if women with children are getting jobs or not getting jobs. So they sent out these fake CVs to prospective employers. Half were men's names, half were women's names, and they stated that they were parents. What do you think the findings were? Women with children were 50% less likely to get a response from an employer. Now, why this is disappointing, I have to say I wasn't shocked by that. I was disappointed but not shocked that they found that out. But it confirmed, I suppose, some of the experience that I'd seen in the workplace. However, men with children were slightly more likely than any other applicant to get a call back for interview. That did surprise me. So we now have got to a point where women who are mothers we're able to show that they're less likely to get employment, but men who are fathers are more likely to. Now, I did feel a little down about this for a little while. I did sort of feel like I was in the one step backwards, it will all be ruined place. But actually, I do think there is a really nice silver lining to this cloud, because my strong belief and premise is that the more that men are engaged in all of the work that happens in the home and in the workforce, and the more that men are taking options like part-time work and being active parents, the more we will actually change that penalty. So it's not a great finding in some ways, but it's actually path of change. And when you look for those silver linings, that is one of them. So we've got a motherhood penalty and a fatherhood bonus. And then they actually looked at mothers being offered the salary. So they went from the employment part to the money part. We all know money matters. 11,000 less than women without children. So that's the penalty between women with children and women without. But again, fathers were offered salaries of about 2,000 more than men without children. So we're seeing it in the employment and we're seeing it in the salaries. But now we know it, we can start doing something about it. And that is the positive part of my message. It's understanding what the things are we have to change and then banding together to actually change them. So I have cheekily called this slide, "Let's Fix the Women." And I say this because it's a confession of one of the biases that I fall into as well. And it may be something that you've hit too. So you come across a situation where there's not enough women on a board or in a committee or in an executive, and you say, what should we do? And often, and I confess this myself, one of the first things you do is say, let's do a leadership course for women, or let's make women think differently about their CVs, or let's, do all these things. And it's all about, for want of another word, victim blaming. It's not actually looking at the cause of how we've come to this situation, but it's actually saying, let's fix you women, it will be all right. And I always remind myself, and I want to put it out there to the room, it's actually about us fixing the system and changing that system. It's not about saying always, women go and do the course and come back later. And look, those courses are important and we're not going to change this overnight. So I'm still a strong advocate for all of the different parts of the puzzle that we need to do. But every answer that just actually asks for the woman or the person who's been discriminated against to try a bit harder, jump a bit higher, run a bit faster, is not actually changing the system that created that situation. And I very much see that in my workplace. I've been in the role for a couple of years, and I've managed over that time to go from an executive group that was about 25% women to men to actually achieving 50-50 just in my last restructure, and that has been involved promoting some women in the organisation who have been actually such solid people in delivering such excellent work, but really probably have not had their light shine as brightly in the cut and thrust of what was happening. And it's been part of the questioning about what it is we value and what it is we need to deliver that has actually seen us be able to structure ourselves differently and actually meet some of the leadership's challenges that we've set ourselves. So I think that in our relationships, workplaces, all of the roles that we carry out as community leaders, there is a huge part of change that we can make that isn't about sitting back and saying, oh, well, I've sorted it out now, so it's fine, but actually challenging ourselves and others about those unconscious biases, those opportunities to do things better, and thinking sometimes outside of the square. So what is it that the leadership challenge looks like for you in your place? And one of the ones that always strikes me, and I feel it incumbent to talk about it on International Women's Day, is that in fact the number of hours or the number of women and men who spend the equal number in their households of doing the unpaid work is 9%. So the other 91% of households have not achieved that, and it's the 50-50 balance. So it's the work that happens out, the full-time job that so many women carry outside of the workforce that we've been looking at as employers and as a society about where some change needs to happen. So we're not going to just fix the women and we're not going to just look at blaming, but we are going to look ahead. And this is the part where I do remind myself to be positive, although, like many of you, probably didn't love some of the messages that were coming from the election of the President in the United States about the role of women, and found myself dwelling on those slightly. But you actually cannot just take one incident and let that unravel all of the good hard work we've done. It's too important to do that. And the future does look positive in terms of the way that our boys and girls are operating already in our society, the understanding of respectful relationships, organisations taking a stand on things like domestic violence and the role of violence in our society. These are things that will make life better for men and for women. And that is such I think, a pervading point to make, that for every bit of equality we achieve, that is actually better for girls and for boys, and it is not a zero-sum game, and it's not taking something from one group for another, because achieving equality doesn't have to be taking from one and getting to another. It's a very important point that we all need to remember when the challenges are there, because sometimes taking power from people feels different from achieving equality, and there is threats that happen there. So I think all of us can be part of the change, and actively seeing, believing and being proactive in how we can achieve a more gender-inclusive society is a very important move. So, be bold for change. This is the theme of International Women's Day. And I wanted to just share with you a bit of a story now about the time of being Chief Executive and what that's meant for me in terms of my organisation. And this really is now just reflecting on being the leader of an environment organisation in our state that had been operating in a very similar way for a very long time. And so I arrived 2 years ago, brand new really. I'd been in state government for a long time, but brand new to the environment sector. I had, of course, grown up in Mannum, so my connection to the River Murray was undisputable and worn absolutely proudly. But the recognition for me was how to lead and to think about leading in a place that was respectful to what had happened, but was able to provide some transformation. And the three things, I suppose, that I wanted to share with you before I'm happy to take any questions or challenges or random thoughts from the floor. But I really thought about what I wanted my leadership to mean in the organisation. And one of the strong messages that I wanted to do and did do, but took some, I think, personal courage, was to say to all of the staff, and it's about 2,000 people, I am not here to be the expert of you. I am not the person in this organisation who knows more than you about the environment. I mean, not the least because there is a PhD on every corner in my department, I can tell you. But I am here to translate the work we do to the Cabinet, to the Minister, to the other government departments, and most importantly, to the community, because we have such an important story. We are the landholder of over 25% of the state, the Environment Department, between all of the Crown lands and national parks. That is a huge part of the economic opportunity for South Australia. It's a huge part of what we all know and love in terms of our parks and our connection to nature. We have all of the tools and abilities in terms of a healthy lifestyle, in terms of a clean, green environment, in terms of food and wine. We are the backbone of so many parts of what makes our state great. And so if we're sitting isolated, and occasionally the Environment Department was very isolated, we're not going to be able to help those levers to increase jobs in our state, increase nature-based tourism, increase our food and wine story, increase our connection with Asian countries and our exports. And so my job, and the part of the bravery, was saying, I'm here, I'm new, I'm young, I'm a woman, I'm different on all of the ways that you expect. But the thing that I can do is take our work and make our partnership strong and make our story strong in the community. And 2 years in, that has been the part of my job, I suppose, that I can safely say I have loved the most, seeing both other people realise the great work that we do, but actually seeing my staff really proud and really owning the stories and the journey that they've been on, and the strength of the connection to parks, kids doing nature play across Adelaide. The recent refurbishment and rejuvenation of one of the parks at Cobblers Creek has seen a community down there who reported to us that they have never been in a national park before they went to that playground. And these are a community that have often had first and second and third generational unemployment. So the difference in transforming lives that we can make with all of the tools that are available to us in the Department of Environment and Water and Natural Resources is a pretty exciting thing. And so being the leader of an organisation where I've made it my job to untap those resources and untap those stories is really the reason I get out of bed in the morning, and it's a pretty exciting place to be. So thank you for listening to me and my sort of two paths of a story there. I wish you all a very happy International Women's Day, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandy. That was an outstanding presentation, especially for today. We've got some questions. As always, Rotarians always ask questions. Chris.
Thank you very much for your address. I think you said that you've achieved a 50-50 balance now in your senior executive staff in the department. I've got two questions really. One, what was it when you joined 2 years ago?
Yeah.
And how did you get there? Did it actually require positive discrimination to get there, or how did you go about it?
So what measures matters, and I don't want to feel like I'm tricking you with the data, but so my former structure had myself as chief executive and 3 deputies who were all men, so that was the 4 of us, so it was 25% in that executive committee. Upon one of those men leaving at the end of the year, I decided to do a restructure where I flattened out, so instead of having a deputy chief executive and other people in the middle, I flattened the executive to now give me 6 direct reports. So 3 of those are men and 3 are women. So for most of those people, only 1 new person into the mix, their jobs didn't change. There was no someone missed out on one job and got another. What did change was I changed their leadership role in the organisation. So I made them a direct report to me, and I've asked them to rise up as a leader in our organisation, demonstrating what we stand for and what we want to be. So essentially, with no more money, in fact I even saved some, and no job losses, I've actually been able to, I suppose, get more hands-on but bring more people up to be part of that leadership. And to me, if you can do that in that way, you're actually able to bring people on the journey who really support the change rather than feeling like there was an unfairness or they didn't see how it happened. And there's lots of different ways to do that, and I really urge my colleagues and my teams to think not just about keeping the way things have always been, but actually think outside the box to achieve that leadership.
Barry Noble.
Thanks very much, Sandy, for a great talk. My question was around the very same subject, so I wanted to get in next, so thanks for that. What was the reaction of the men, 2 groups? The ones who made the cut and the ones who didn't?
Well, it's nice to have win-win-win, but no one, so the 2 existing men who were group executive directors remained in those roles, so no one didn't make the cut in that sense. So I didn't have to deal with the situation of people, the haves and have-nots. I suppose in one sense you could say they manage less of the bigger picture, but actually their jobs are still pretty fundamentally ambitious and large. So I was able to do it in a way that was really win-win, and I was actually able to bring the whole group along with me. We had a big debates about what was the best way to do this. I suppose, led with my vision of having better clarity to the outside world. So we used to have lots of public service code like strategy and advice and science knowledge and monitoring and all of these codes that the outside world doesn't understand, and I'm very aware of that. And so what I was able to do was say, right, the climate change group's going to be called Climate Change Group, and the science group is going to be called Science, and actually really reformed and not just flattened in the sense of having one less layer, but actually I hope, and this is the ambition that we're all really excited about, have made it much more clear about what we do, because often our department gets also just referred to as JUNA, which is an acronym, and acronyms are terrible for people understanding what you do. And so the message that we're the people who are saving the River Murray for South Australia, and we're the people working on nature tourism so that all of our children and our children's children can enjoy our great state, was a bit lost in the language.
Thanks, Sandy. If you can't see it, you can't be it. And the whole concept of role models, I think, is terrific, and I get that. As a bloke, if I see a role model, in quotes, example, Mr. Trump, who says, opens his mouth, then the immediate reaction is, that's dumb, and so on. Trying not to bring in my unconscious bias, but as a woman, if you see a woman say or do something dumb as a leader, how do you feel? And what's the reaction as a woman to... I'm thinking of politicians locally as an example.
Yeah. Look, I do... Are you in Queensland? I do think one of my biases is, or one of my concerns is that I feel like because there are so few women at the top, I do feel a don't let me down sisters feeling, and that's unfair because it is, well, it's not unfair, but it's recognising that there's more probably on the shoulders of any minority when you have them, and so women in a leadership role are definitely in a minority. And part of it I've tried to do, especially with colleagues, when you can see, you know, minor things are happening that don't feel good in terms of organisational culture, is being really respectful and recognising that often, whether it be media or just the way our organisations work, there's a lot more scrutiny on women in the way we do our work. And I know that I've had that happen to me just in terms of judgments about how I look after my children or how all of these things work. And, you know, you get strong shoulders, but sometimes it can niggle away. Or, you know, I've had the circumstance where I've been sitting at a meeting and, you know, made a point, and then sort of 3 minutes later someone else has said the point to rousing cheers, and it's very frustrating. I did have the opportunity recently to say, excuse me, but actually I think, I'll just say the word Jane. Jane said that a few minutes ago, but it's great you agree with it, you know, Bob. It felt very satisfying for me and Jane. I'm not sure if anyone else in the room actually noticed.
Ma'am, we as taxpayers are very interested in what it costs to run these departments. What's this 6-man or lady executive cost to run? I'm interested in the cost factor.
Sure. Look, I won't be able to give you the exact dollar figures, but the thing I can tell you is that even though I've given them new responsibilities, I haven't given them more money. So it actually costs less than my previous executive structure. And that is just by the chance of the person who left being the deputy. So it's actually not cost any more to change the way I've run this structure. It's actually made a salary saving. But that's because I've asked those people to take on more responsibility in the leadership. Sure.
They're equally sharing the load, but we're interested in what the money value is that your department is costing, because we do this with every department, not just yours.
Sure, and look, I can talk through all of the parts. All I'm saying is that I'm not costing any more or less than I did 5 months ago, is my point. look, I run a budget that's into the multi-millions, and that's from works that happen on the Murray River in terms of massive projects, infrastructure projects that are jobs. I've got 140 sites around the state, which are national parks, conservation parks and other things. And we have scientists who do water monitoring from mining, for groundwater extraction, for water licensing. So the diversity of what we run is huge, and the cost of what we run is huge, and we're very publicly accountable for our dollars. So you can go onto my website, the Auditor General's website, and see not just our whole cost of department, but actually where we spend that money. And the accountability point, I think, is really important, because the internet gives us lots of bad things, but it also gives us that chance for accountability. And you can actually look and see every dollar that I've spent. My credit card bills are up online every month, so you can see what I spent my credit card on. You can see where I've travelled to. The accountability that chief executives now have on my taxis are all up there. So that accountability is really strong, and I really support it, although, you know, sometimes it can be a burden to do. It is actually about serving the public and what public servants do spend, because it is your taxpayer dollars and my taxpayer dollars, and greater accountability, I think, helps greater performance, greater questioning, and actually greater productivity. So it is there, and I welcome you seeing it. I'm so sorry, I have to go.
Thank you very much for your question. Sandy does have to go, but before you go, Sandy, from one public servant to another, thank you very much, and from one woman to another as well, for helping to continue to lead the way. Can we all say a wonderful Rotary thank you to Sandy Pitcher?